So the next presentation is co-presenting, and that is Dr. Marwan Kilani, and he earned his his Master of Philosophy in 2012 and his Doctor of Philosophy in 2017 in Ancient Near Eastern Studies from the University of Oxford. He worked as a director for two centuries, oh yeah, for two research projects sponsored by the Swiss National Science Foundation, focusing on interactions between imperial and indigenous realities in the ancient Near East, currently exploring how historical, empirical, and colonial experiences shape the social landscape of a region over the centuries. Sawsan Samara earned a Master of Science in Social Anthropology in 2012 and a certificate in International Human Rights Law in 2014 from Oxford University. Sawsan worked in the Middle East for 7 years in the humanitarian and development sectors, with a focus on indigenous people, refugees, and then racial discrimination and apartheid. Currently, she's working on Palestinian indigenousness and their systematized racial segregation, in addition to documenting the history and heritage of the Nisbel, I probably said that horribly, a Palestine village. Their talk will be on becoming indigenous in the 21st century, indigenous perspectives on an emerging indigenous identity. You're set to go. It's your floor.
Thank you very much. And I will start. The Israeli-Palestinian issue is probably one of the best known and most discussed geopolitical issues in the contemporary world. However, there are voices in this global discussion that so far have remained largely unrecognized and unaddressed. The voice of indigenous people. Palestinians have been defining themselves as indigenous people at least since the 80s. Identities, however, are always composed by two elements: the identity we self-assign to ourselves and the identity ascribed to us by others. In our presentation today, we will focus on this second dimension, on the indigenous opinions about the Palestinian indigenousness. In particular, we will start from the following three research questions. Do indigenous persons recognize the Palestinians as indigenous people? Is the indigenousness of the Palestinians a factor in their way of framing the Israeli-Palestinian issue? And why indigenous people recognize the Palestinians as indigenous? Which aspects are highlighted, and what do they tell us? Before we start, a few words about our methodology. We have collected voices from various sources, from academic publications, social media, blogs, and above all from and through indigenous people that we are personally in contact with in various parts of the world. In this respect, some communities resulted easier to investigate than others, both because some are more vocal about these topics and because of practical issues like language barriers. Therefore, our sample is as wide and varied as possible for us, but it doesn't pretend to be complete or exhaustive, rather the opposite. Actually, our study is a preliminary survey of the topic, something that we would like to further investigate in the future. So if you have data or want to collaborate, please get in touch. Our presentation today has also to be understood as qualitative rather than quantitative, in the sense that we are collecting examples and we are not claiming they represent the whole communities. They represent some voices within such communities, and we know that opposite voices also exist. In our survey, we have recognized three distinct groups. First, we couldn't find any reference to the indigenousness of Palestinians in sources from indigenous communities in Asia, Africa, and Northern Europe. Also because problem of accessing these sources, actually. And when the Israeli-Palestinian issue is discussed by these communities, often through different frames. Then we have Central and South America. In this case, Palestinians are often explicitly recognized as indigenous people, but this appears as a secondary feature within a general discourse that framed the Israeli-Palestinian issue as a global South versus global imperialism thing. Finally, we have the indigenous communities of Canada, the US and Hawaii, Australia, and New Zealand. In their case, Palestinians are implicitly or explicitly recognized as indigenous people, and such indigenousness is often central in the discourse about the issue. In this presentation, we will focus on this last group. First, we will present a selection of cases. You have them in the handout, and you find the handout in the chat. And for these cases, we will highlight a series of keywords. This example will be organized into 3 venues: personal experiences and individual voices, public and collective voices, analytical voices. We will then move to the analysis and the conclusions. So let's start with the personal experiences and individual voices. Our first example is Frank Wall. He is a Lakota singer who visited Palestine in 2017. He described the experience in a series of tweets in which he points out the settler colonialism, the fact that the Palestinian reality mirrors the history of his own community, the colonization of the land, the media framing colonization as a conflict, thus delegitimizing the indigenous self-defense and resistance. He highlights also the use of law against indigenous communities, the colonial borders, the connection with police abuses in the US, and the connection between the conditions of Black, brown, and indigenous people. Erica Violet Lee, instead, is a Plains Cree poet, feminist, and activist. Among the poems she wrote, there is one in which she connects the Palestinian reality with the Native American ones. In it, she talks about women, their suffering, and their active role in the struggle, about the occupation and colonization of the land, about displacement and homes being lost, about violence, and again, about the memory and mirroring of the past. Emi is a Maori woman. During the last escalation in Palestine, she tweeted, "As a Maori person, watching the brutal violence Israel unleashes almost entirely on civilians gives me a window into how the world saw the colonialist butchery of my ancestor. We too were decried as primitive and violent by the people orphaning our kids as the world watched. Colonialism relies on the ideological cover that indigenous people have no rights to self-defense. Anything we do to resist being killed is used as justification for killing us. Israel is shelling Gaza like British shelled Rupe Kapeka, killing because we refuse to die." Now, moving to public and collective voices, this is an article published in 1984 in the Aboriginal newspaper Black Nations. This is the earliest example we have found in which Aboriginal people talk about Palestine. They first stress the human family, but then they compare Zionist Israel with apartheid South Africa, and then they equate the oppressed Palestinians with themselves, Aboriginal people, as both have been dispossessed of their land and kept off by force. More recently, some Aboriginal activists displayed these signs at the protest against the Land Forces Weapon Fair in Brisbane. In the associated Facebook post, they stressed the role of the weapon industry in stealing indigenous land and in the abuses of the police and the army, which they also seen as making up stories to justify the violence. They also implicitly equate the Aboriginal experience with the Western Papuan and Palestinian struggles and with the Black Lives Matter movement. Chris Uriwai is a Maori activist who recently urged Maori to stand for Palestine. He mentions sovereignty and highlights the similarity in the colonial control, and he uses Maori words specifically related with the Maori experience to talk about Palestine. He also mentions the global dimension of the issue, saying that what affects Maori affects also others, and calls for a global awareness in order to have global solidarity and global solutions. Our next example is a protest organized by Navajo activists in Arizona to voice their opposition to any relationship between the tribe and Israel. They especially stressed the issue of sovereignty and self-determination, and they equated the rights of the Palestinians to the rights of the Navajo nation. While in 2020, a Palestinian flag was hoisted alongside the Mohawk and Hiawatha flags at a pipeline protest in Ontario, one of the protesters claimed, "We proudly hung up the Palestinian flag at the rail blockade because we recognize the Palestinian struggle." Finally, moving to the analytical indigenous voices. Interestingly, this is the group for which we have found less examples. We can mention a discussion about Palestine that was broadcast by an Aboriginal radio in Brisbane in May, which reflects the discussion within the Aboriginal community in the area and which stressed once again the common struggle and the issues of land rights, land dispossession, and sovereignty. Finally, we have Dr. Kehaulani Kawanui from Hawaii. She is professor of American Studies and Anthropology, and she has been writing a book comparing the Palestinian reality with indigenous realities in the US. In the book, she discusses the communalities in terms of politics of occupation and settler colonialism, and stress the importance of going beyond exceptionalism and statist solutions, and to investigate instead the shared structural communalities. To my knowledge, she is the only prominent indigenous scholar who has been analyzing the Palestinian issue within an indigenous frame in a Western academic context. As you probably have noticed, these examples were characterized by recurrent themes. Some of them, like the themes of colonialism and land rights, were common across the examples and the venues. Others instead were associated with specific venues. For instance, individual voices often stress the emotional aspect associated with the experiences of the ancestors. Collective voices instead often stress the question of rights toward and in relation with the state and economic actors. And analytical voices instead focus on deconstructing and understanding what is going on. And I leave now the floor to Sawsan, who will analyze some of these themes more in detail.
Thank you, Marwan. Can everybody hear me? Sorry, I'm using a mic. So the next section of the presentation will look at the shared indigenous experience between themselves and the Palestinians. We will look at it through, we will look at it through analyzing the effects of British colonialism and its counterinsurgency strategy, given that the main factor or a main factor in indigenousness or becoming indigenous is the experience of subordination status on their land due to a colonial or post-colonial reality. So one of the key words that we picked up from Marwan's presentation is to mirror or remind indigenous of their history. And I quote Frank Won, "What I witnessed was settler colonialism and genocide happening in a way that mirrored what I know about how the US government enacted genocide on my people." Now, even though the colonizing powers are different and the indigenous people are different, there are two similar principles in their colonization. First is the approach to controlling the indigenous population, which is in essence the same. The main principles are the same. And then the evolutionary nature of the techniques used to control the local population. This is evident in the counterinsurgency field, starting with that of colonizers to fight and control the local populations being colonized, and extends to today's army manuals on counterinsurgency. The main lessons learned are, and I quote two quotes, that counterinsurgency in the modern sense emerged from the experience of imperial warfare stretching back into the 19th century. Or by looking more closely at the development of both insurgency and counterinsurgency during the period of the late 19th century through to post-World War II, we can get a sense of the elements of continuity and change. Hence, what the indigenous people are describing is right on target. The experience of Palestinians with settler colonialism resembles that of their own people, as Native Americans in the US expressed. We will explore this further by looking at three main shared experiences. We'll look at the brutality, which is one of the keywords that they expressed, so violence and abuses against individuals. We will look at narratives to delegitimize resistance, and we will look at the loss of land or land rights and sovereignty. However, there are many more shared experiences, like the law, changing the law to express that, to legalize the colonialism experience, and many, many more. But before I get into the three shared experiences, it is important to point out the common British element, actually, in this case, among the three known indigenous experiences. where the Native American experience, for example, is that which started with the British and extended by the US. The Aboriginal Australians is that again started with the British and extended through the Australian government, while the Palestinian experience is that which started with the British again and extended with the Israeli occupation. So the first experience we will explore is through the keyword violence, abuses against individuals, and I added police between quotation because the police and policing the situation was a key element. So I quote, "You and me, we know violence, the pain of our mothers," which is an excerpt from Our Revolution by Erica Violet Lee, which my colleague Marwan outlined at the beginning. Erica, among many others, talk about the violence they experienced. In the colonial counterinsurgency approach, brutality was a key element. So the colonial context permitted techniques that involved great brutality and might be unacceptable in regular warfare, and obviously outside of humanitarian law. These techniques were evidently used by the British in addition to the American, French, in their colonial encounters. The examples of those counterinsurgent wars fought by the British include cases in which the colonialists were looking to seize the land, while other examples are those that are more recent and through which the colonizers only looked to control the population, such as the US troops in Vietnam or in Iraq. The practice and emphasis on brutality resulted in three forms that are considered strategic in trying to enforce the support for the colonial rule: beatings and torture, murders, and forced population movement. And there are others, but these are the ones that were highlighted throughout the 19th century into the 20th. In addition, there was emphasis on the continued policing. The idea that continued imperial policing is highlighted as necessary in defeating the revolutionist opponents. So how did this unfold in the Palestinian context? I tried to draw parallels between historical brutality against the indigenous in the past and those against Palestinians today. So for the brutal act of forced population movement, we see during what Palestinians called the Nakba in 1948, or the ethnic cleansing of Palestine from Palestinians, those that didn't leave were lined up and often killed by colonialist Israelis. For murders, since then, Israelis have practiced various types of murders, assassinations, and more. This is of this one in specific is of the medic in Gaza that was assassinated while on duty in 2018 during the Freedom March, in which Israeli soldiers were lethally shooting Palestinian protesters, peaceful protesters, may I add. And then you have for the beatings and torture, this is a recent photo of a police officer beating a native young tourist, with a parallel of Israeli soldiers beating Palestinian child and arresting him. This picture of the Palestinian child is not unique, and hence I actually don't have the date for that, or the specific instance, but rather it is one of many instances. The Palestinian photos are depicting the Israeli settler colonialist rule and occupation, although the colonialist rule preceded the Israelis and started with the British rule. So there are even more direct parallels with the British, but it was harder to find illustration, as it is with the indigenous people as well. The second keyword is the narratives to delegitimize resistance. So we heard from my colleague Marwan some quotes, one of which is, one of the biggest similarities I see is how media frames colonization and genocide as a conflict, quote unquote, or battle, quote unquote, between two sides, and when in fact it is one side colonizing while people defend themselves against that genocide. They did the same and called our massacres battles, quote unquote. The other is watching the brutal violence Israel unleashes almost entirely on civilians gives me a window into how the world saw the colonialist butchery of my ancestors. We too were decried as primitive and violent by the people orphaning our kids as the world watched. So there are two aspects here that colonizers often used to reframe the struggle. The first is an apolitical focus in which the colonials see colonial opposition in apolitical terms and use simplistic words and terms to describe the population, like savages or semi-civilized races in the past, or today in the context of terrorists, uncivilized, violent, underdeveloped. Although the words are not explicitly used today, they are put in that context. And they're not seen, they're seen as such rather than people with rights being deprived and fighting to preserve their basic rights. The other is equal sides in the struggle. So they're often presented as equal sides with equal rights using phrasings like conflicts or other very neutralizing words. Some authors that researched and highlighted this further is Sawsan analyzes the great array of mass media sources demonstrating how the propaganda formed an integral part of counterinsurgency strategy. Not, quote, not only did British governments and their colonial officials produce their own publicity material on events in troubled colonies, they also sought to shape how the media in Britain and elsewhere reported from them. Another is, quote, the British have a habit of promoting settler colonialism or promoting one side over another in the lands they control. So how did that play in the Palestinian experience? So we notice in the media covering Palestinians are described. We noticed them in the media covering Palestinian issues, how, for example, Israel's crimes are expressed in passive voice or as reaction or effort. Blatant dismissal of the pain, damages, oppression, and in many ways dehumanization that Palestinians are experiencing on top of the inequalities of daily life there. You have reference to Palestinians with violence versus Israelis as victims. And furthermore, Palestinians as unknowns actually, and Israelis as we would know their name, their history, their education, where they lived, and their whole story. And then you have decontextualizing and or selecting the reporting. There are specific words that we see often. So instead of saying, so they say dies instead of killed, eviction instead of forced expulsion, fled instead of forced to flee, clashes instead of Israeli raids, flare-ups of clashes instead of Israeli bombardment, and a lot more. Type of coverage that Indigenous people relate to. I show examples here of Indigenous trying to rephrase the words used publicly, and Palestinian doing the same in the media. So in the Palestinian context, during the recent Jerusalem events, instead of Palestinians stone Israeli car which crashes, Palestinians rewrote the title to say, Zionist settlers tries to run over Palestinians, crashes car. And then another in reference to Jerusalem's forced expulsions of Sheikh Jarrah, East Jerusalem, which is happening actually up until today. So the media would say evictions in Jerusalem become focus of Israeli-Palestinian conflict. it becomes forced expulsions in Jerusalem become focus of Palestinian struggle. The third keyword we're looking at is the loss of land, land rights, and the sovereignty. So I quote, "We too have been dispossessed of our land by strangers and are kept off by brute force," unquote. We share, quote, "a history of being moved, removed, moved again, taken from our homes and wondering if we'll ever go back," unquote. The colonialists use few approaches. The first of which is the fragmentation of land to control the population. So David Galula, which is a famous French military officer and theorist for counterinsurgency approaches, and actually his approach is the basis of modern day army manuals on counterinsurgency, had an 8-step approach to control the population. Steps 2 and 3 were about detaching the areas through installing sufficient troops in the hamlets, villages, towns, or anywhere where the population lives, and then establish contact with the population, control its movements in order to cut off its links with the guerrillas. These were done through checkpoints, border controls, and ports of entry, protection of critical sites, area security operations and site exploitation, population census using biometric data collection devices and mapping the human environment and patterns of life. Another is to control the population while seizing, sorry, I misspelled seizing here, seizing the land. The essence of the shared indigenous experience here is the idea that in both cases, the colonizers were looking to seize land for their own population, which is the unique aspect and what the indigenous people recognize as similar between their experience and that of the Palestinian. And then the third approach is seizing the land by treaties. So we heard actually 2 days ago from Darrell Baldwin in this conference, the Miami Scholar and MacArthur Foundation recipient. He spoke on day 1 about the treaties signed for land seizure. During his talk about the Mia Center, in most cases, in exchange for eliminating brutality and ethnic cleansing, the indigenous population signs a treaty giving that land away. So how does that play out in the Palestinian experience? I illustrated the maps of 2 major indigenous areas that experience extreme land seizure and colonization, the US and Australia, and then a parallel with the Palestinian map. You can notice the continued expropriation of land in the Palestinian case, still happening today, and continues to be an alive colonizing experience. So this map is only till 2007. We have additional map with the Trump administration plan proposed, and I'm sure in 2 years we'll have another map coming up soon. The other map I'm going to show is a zoom into the Oslo Accords, or the treaty signed, the treaty signed by the Palestinians with the Israelis in 1993, dividing the land between quote unquote mainland Israel, which is the land that is in gray and is completely at this point lost by the Palestinians, lost the claim to it as well. And then you have the West Bank area, or the colored areas, where it was divided into Area C, Area B, and Area A, where Area C is the lighter red. Area C is the white part, and it's basically controlled fully by Israelis. So the population, the settlers move in there, the Israeli settlers as in, and then the security and the force and the services are all controlled by Israel. And then you have Area B, which is the lighter red, and there are areas where a Palestinian population still lives, but then the security is controlled by Israel. And then you have finally Area A, which the Palestinians have full autonomy of, but they're closed off completely, making them look like reservation camps today, or even Bantustans in the case of South Africa. And there's between those areas are all the checkpoints, the border controls, the ports of entry. There are often areas where classified as closed military zones, and so on and so forth. And it gets more complicated, but this is somehow simplifying it. So through these three examples on brutality, narratives, and land loss, we see the parallels between the indigenous experience and the Palestinian experience. The parallels that the activists and the individuals are relating to and seeing as a mirrored experience. The voices of the indigenous are actually acknowledging two things: linking the painful experience of the two distant people and proving the same type of colonial rule, where again, Palestine, like I said, is a mirror and a way for the indigenous communities to reflect, put their experience in perspective, and understand their own indigenous history. Apologies for the background noise. And then Palestine allows the recognition of common experience and an opportunity to call for unity. The other aspect, actually, that the voices of the indigenous are acknowledging is re-legitimizing and emphasizing that Palestinians are indeed indigenous people just like themselves. So hence, we wanted to conclude by saying that becoming an indigenous is not bounded by time, but rather by the shared experience of the act of colonialism, and in this case, the same type of colonialism. Palestinians are the most recent colonized people, a situation that continues to exist till today and mirrors all other colonial experience, and especially those with controlled sovereignty. That link is not made in academia, although few academic voices exist, but rather still led and louder among individuals and then activists and grassroots groups. It is therefore unstructured or not mainstreamed yet, which is in contrast with other topics such as post-colonialism, critical race theory, or many others, where it is usually built in academia and filtered down to the indigenous communities. And for that, I actually thank Dr. Greymorning for giving that opportunity to voice that academic aspect.
Thank you.
I will conclude actually with, one slide, which is also a quote from an indigenous, and he says, "When we can band together in solidarity, we'll start to see some type of global process against it." And this is what we hope to achieve. We have a actually Facebook group or page where we put indigenous news, and we invite all of you to contribute. Thank you.
Thank you for a very powerful presentation. I will open this up for any questions or discussion, because this really is not necessarily a question and answer, but more, think of it more as a time to discuss certain issues, or if you have questions, then ask questions. So let's open it up. Hannah, I see a hand. I'm not sure if your hand is up because you have a question or you're just raising a hand.
Sorry, it's supposed to be the clap icon as my applause.
Okay, I thought you had your hand like you were raising.
My apologies.
Misty.
So like with all the talks I've heard over the last days. I feel like in a lot of ways it's Indigenous people are being gaslighted is the best way to say it. It's just like where it hits you emotional and then it also makes you question things. And I feel like that's the kind of the same thing that you guys go through. It's like how you're raised one way, but then there's some other person that's supposed to be like higher up or have letters behind their name that tells you, oh no, that's not how it's supposed to be. And then it makes you question yourself. I don't know if you guys have that issue.
Sawsan, I think.
I mean, if I understood your comments correctly, I mean, indeed, I was fortunate not to have grown up in a colonialist setting, but rather maybe a colonizer, actually. So I lived in several in diaspora and so on and so forth, and one of which was the US, actually. When you go to Palestine and talk to people, you're right, they don't realize that this is not normal. You see these kids growing up and they think this is how life is. They live their daily day to day, just surviving, and then this is what they should do. They don't realize that, no, this is great injustice that's being imposed, and actually it's not. I think the revelation here that I found superbly interesting, looking at when Marwan and I started looking at Indigenous experiences, was that we're not alone, actually. Palestinians are not alone, and this is a shared, very strong shared experience that's very underrepresented and not mainstreamed when it should. I mean, everything about, for example, counterinsurgency was mainstreamed through colonial powers, and it's their approach of how to handle the situation. But it was never about how we handled it back, for example, as Indigenous. So I hope I addressed your comment.
And if I may add something, I think this is actually something we were wondering and thinking, reading, like looking for these data and these examples. One thing that emerged is how sharp the comments of Indigenous people from any part of the world are in analyzing this situation. But this applies in analyzing the Palestinian situation, but for instance, also Aboriginal people talking about Papua, which is another case of contemporary colonialism. And what is interesting is that this discussion is happening in Indigenous communities outside of academia. And it would be very interesting to actually have more of these Indigenous voices within academia. So having more discussion from Indigenous scholars about realities in other Indigenous communities around the world, because as you mentioned, looking at other communities allows you to actually put your own experience in perspective and to realize that actually, as Sawsan said, no, this is not normality, and actually this is not exceptional, but this part of dynamics that are the consequence of bigger phenomena like colonialism and so on.
And I would add one tiny note, is that not only puts it in perspective, but allows the building on one another, and then the incremental learning to develop the approach of whether it's resisting or voicing or other goals that we're looking, or Indigenous people are looking to achieve.
And another, like, leave a comment on that. There is also a psychological element in looking at the others and others' experience, because these kind of experience are traumatic, and they are traumas for the communities involved. And often it's very difficult for the people involved, and this applies to in our experience, applies to Palestinians, but also to Indigenous people. it is difficult to look at our own situations and the experience in the present or the past. So in a way, it is easier to actually look at other communities and then using other communities again as a mirror to then go back and digest and process the personal experiences.
So if I could just pick up on that image of the mirror, that's something that I've seen happening currently in Corsica, a Mediterranean island that has been part of France since the middle of the 1700s. And since the middle of the 1700s, there have been various forms of resistance, but in the second half of the 20th century, a process of identifying those kinds of similarities, I would argue has, or at the time, sort of sparked a similar process of becoming indigenous and an awareness emerging among, certain sectors of the Corsican community that they, particularly in respect to sovereignty, language, land rights, do have a lot in common with indigenous communities that, for a host of reasons, are still called, tribal, as if to imply that somehow differentiates them from European peoples, and the idea that there are no indigenous peoples in Europe because it's full of Europeans. So at some of the events in Corsica, I've seen explicit demonstrations of solidarity with indigenous people in different parts of the world, including the Palestinian. And so I'm glad you put that Facebook group there, because I, glad to share some links in both directions if those connections aren't already being made.
Yes, if I may comment, another very good example of these dynamics in Europe is Ireland. And Ireland as well has a very strong tradition of solidarities, both with indigenous people, for instance, in North America, and with Palestine. And again, it shows that it's a question of shared experience, in the case of Ireland specifically, within a British colonial experience that goes back to the Middle Age, actually, more than actually, let's say, UN definition of what an indigenous population is. So indeed, and this is another aspect that we find interesting. I think it would be interesting to move away from the often implicitly assumed idea that indigenousness is in opposition with European or white people, because it's not the case. There are cases also of very white, very European people who actually have experienced the same dynamics that other indigenous people around the world had to live through.
And actually,
Yeah.
sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was simply going to say the theory of coloniality, the premise that there is some essential characteristic that makes any given historical or geographical case of colonialism colonial. And if you look at the essence of coloniality, then a lot of European state formation fits that model. And the unfinished manuscript that was found in Gramsci's typewriter when he was carted off to jail was the famous Notes on the Southern Question, where he uses the phrase, being reduced to a colonial subjugation to talk about the formation of the Italian state. And that, of course, has spawned quite a bit of theoretical development along those lines. But yeah, so for my own development of my thinking along those lines, that coloniality, indigeneity dynamic was very useful, because if you remove the geographical and historical specificity, then, as I say, Corsica, Ireland, Malta, Southern Italy, so, and so on, so on, so on.
Right. And I just wanted to add about the Ireland example, in which the British actually used the same techniques in Ireland historically, but adjusted more because they were other white people. So there is a bit of a more of a change, let's say, in that aspect. But then I would also add the example of Scotland, which I and this was the case study that sort of made me start to wonder and look at other cases, because I saw a lot, although very different, and I think people don't understand it, but I saw a lot of similarities. And it started with, I just went to a museum and I saw a British soldier's costume, but you know, a time of crusades, and then later of the colonizing powers, and I was just like, oh my God, why is this there? And to my surprise, my Scottish colleague was thinking exactly the same thing, and I was like, wow, there's something here. So yeah, if you remove the location and the specificity, you can take that aspects and apply it to many other cases.
Okay, we're going to transition into our next speaker. And if you can
Oh,
stop.
let me